Thank you so much, Oscar. And I'm so grateful to you, Catherine and Kirsten, for organising this timely study day. And I'm really honoured to be on a programme with such an impressive lineup of speakers. I think it was probably quite a wise decision to get me out of the way right at the beginning with that in mind. So I will press on that basis. So I've spent quite a bit of time in previous projects thinking about music within the boundaries of the Playhouse. What role did practical music assume in the dramatic design of commercial plays? How might the period's everyday beliefs about music, particularly about responses to music, be reflected in its Playhouse use? Why did playwrights and playgoers alike see music as such a crucial component of the Playhouse soundscape? And these questions are certainly still continuing to interest me, but I've been finding more and more in my recent work that investigations of theatre music lead out of the Playhouse to other early modern cultural contexts. Music circulation, be that as sound, text, or a fluid combination of both, feels like a particularly pressing topic for early modern studies at the moment, with work including Catherine Larson's important 2019 monograph, The Matter of Song, and the generative essay collection, Beyond Boundaries, Rethinking Music Circulation, two of whose editors I think we're hearing from later today, charting the terrain for what I'm sure will be a large expansion of work in this area in the years ahead. But the more this work takes me beyond the Playhouse, the more I come up against the question of just how important or not its music was to the wider musical culture of early modern London. I feel like its prominence can be sometimes more or less taken as read in studies of Shakespeare music and wider theatre histories. Elsewhere, cultural histories of early modern English music, Christopher Marsh's for one, have afforded Playhouse music a really helpful prominence in wider ranging studies. Today, I want to ask quite simply, how ubiquitous was Playhouse music in early modern London? Considering a variety of forms that Playhouse music's ubiquity might take, or perhaps rather a variety of ways in which you might track its ubiquity, from the narrow context of its constant presence within playtexts to far wider patterns of cultural circulation and transformation. But this line of inquiry also raises further questions that become more pressing the further away we get from the Playhouse itself. What does or doesn't count as Playhouse music? And what might be the limits of that term, Playhouse music, if an investigation is not narrowly limited to theatrical performance? And I'll come back to these questions in the final part of my paper. I'm going to start with a fairly obvious point, which is that there's just a lot of music in early modern drama. We know from playtext evidence that these plays are habitually rich in music. Out of the several hundred playtexts surviving from the period, it's around 600-ish, I think. I don't think I've encountered more than half a dozen that don't contain some kind of musical cue, a practical musical cue. And of course, the nature and the scope of the music varies a lot between companies, venues, over time, but it's consistently prominent in one form or another across the full scope of early modern commercial theatre. So certainly within the plays themselves, I think the ubiquity of music is fairly evident from the evidence. Not only is music ever present in extant playtexts, but there's actually quite clear evidence surviving that playgoers saw music as a particular attraction of the Playhouse, one of the reasons that you went there in the first place. So a further possible ubiquity might be traceable in this perception that theatre going was itself a form of musical experience. This is attested by possibly my favorite early modern document, the fictionalized highwayman Gamaliel Ratsey, in an anonymous road pamphlet, who tells a group of traveling players that he's often gone to the theatre more for music's sake than for action. Just as from the other side of things, the anti-theatrical pamphleteer and former playwright Stephen Gosson complained a few decades earlier that strange consorts of melody to tickle the ear are the first amongst the several aspects of a play that he believes draws audiences to the playhouses of the late 1570s. At the other end of the period, William Prynne, the theatre historian's gift that keeps on giving, cites his own modern experience, as opposed to classical tradition, I think he means, of the same phenomenon. Playgoers apparently led by their itching ears to hear obscene, lascivious love songs of the Caroline stage, which sounds great. Other witnesses who are a bit more sympathetic to the theatre than Prynne appear to have shared this view. Ben Jonson's 1600 induction to Cynthia's Revels, which kind of fictionalizes a conversation between playgoers and members of the company, offers a satirical impersonation of one of your gentle auditors, who proceeds to complain that the theatre's music is abominable, able to stretch a man's ears worse than 10 pillories, while conversely, another character who represents the kind of company perspective complains of playgoers entering the tiring house in order to rail the music out of tune. Unruly these imagined playgoers may be, but clearly there's an expectation on all sides here that music is a central part of the theatrical experience. And of course, we have the most famous example of them all, Frederick Gershau's account of the Children of the Chapel at Blackfriars in 1602, where he talks about the exquisite instrumental concert lasting an entire hour before the play itself begins. And he seems much more interested in that than the play. Taking one kind of further step outwards from this then, I think the prominence of the theatre itself as part of the wider London soundscape is well attested in the textual record as well. And this has been widely acknowledged since Bruce Smith's Acoustic World of Early Modern England. Its sounds are often characterised as being both loud, but also leaky. The 1596 petition against the establishment of a new indoor theatre for Shakespeare's company, a petition signed by their own patron, amongst other Blackfriars residents, which is wonderfully hilarious, is a really kind of nicely colourful example of this. And I'm sorry if that's not the easiest document to read on the PowerPoint. The specific concern that they articulate in the petition is that the theatrical noise of the drums and trumpets will not stay confined to the Playhouse, but will infiltrate religious spaces and disturb preaching ministers. It will greatly disturb and hinder them during times of divine worship, it says. And this is just one particularly kind of colourful example of what is a very widespread trope, that Playhouse music, especially drums and trumpets, but not only, that this music is often in the air as part of the city's wider soundscape, whether or not you're actually attending a play at the time when you hear it. Clearly, this is telling us something about the capacity of particular sounds to travel, but I think it also suggests some kind of prominence in the kind of wider acoustic consciousness afforded to the sounds of the theatre, and specifically the musical sounds associated with these spaces. By my calculations, I'm willing to be corrected on this, there are never fewer than 2 outdoor theatres operating from the point when the Rose opens alongside the theatre in the 1580s, right through to the suppression of the Globe and the Red Bull and so on at the end of the period. And there's perhaps as many as half a dozen competing outdoor theatres operating simultaneously in the mid-1600s heyday of the outdoor venues. Think Starbucks branches around about 2007, and I think you've got the idea there. It's hard to judge exactly when theatres stop because they don't tend to leave a nicely precise kind of moment when they've kind of drifted into dereliction, but certainly we've got a lot of them going on at that time. Whilst noting the play closures, the rhythm of the term time and vacation time that the Inns of Court kind of set for the kind of wider London patterns of presence and absence, possibly patterns of seasonal closure, including things like the Christmas responsibilities at court for some of the companies. All of these certainly mean there would be regular periods where the theatres fell silent. But there are at least a couple of theatres kind of operating throughout the period. Interestingly, the Cries of London, or City Cries musical fad that begins sometime around 1600 or so, doesn't seem to be that interested in incorporating Playhouse sounds into this, the kind of highly stylized urban soundscapes that they claim to approximate. Although on the other hand, oral performance emanating from a nearby playhouse isn't strictly a street cry as such. And I do think these compositions are reasonably precise in limiting their representations to things that people sing or proclaim whilst they're kind of physically on the streets, rather than sounds from nearby buildings. So having offered some thoughts on the prominence of music in Playhouse performance, the importance of this music to playgoers, and the impact of theatrical sounds, especially music on the wider urban soundscape, I now want to try approaching this topic of ubiquitous Playhouse music from a slightly different direction, thinking about what happens when theatre music becomes detached from the Playhouse space itself and turns up in other cultural contexts, whether traceable through performance records or in sources preserving a kind of verbal or musical notation. I'm going to start with one environment that's acknowledged to be a very rich and supportive context for recreational music, and which is actually much better documented in theatrical terms than I think has quite been recognised. And this is the Inns of Court. John Eliot and Alan Nelson's records of early English drama for the Inns appeared as long ago as 2011, but the full extent and significance of the documentary evidence that they've gathered and collated, I think is yet to really be fully registered by by theatre historians and early modern drama scholars. In particular, payment evidence gathered and collated in their volume is often, payment evidence gathered and collated in payment records at several of the inns indicates that the Candlemas 1602 12th night performance in Middle Temple Hall, the one that was famously attended by innsman John Manningham, who writes about the evening in his diary. This doesn't seem to have been a one-off arrangement for which the play might have been specially commissioned. Rather, it's part of a pattern that becomes firmly established in the 17th century. The inns would include a performance by one of the professional theatre companies as part of their feast day revels on All Saints' Night, which is 1st of November, and Candlemas, 2nd of February, on the horizon, every year. This is a kind of companion article which Alan Nelson wrote in that brilliant Inns of Court volume, something that come across, bringing together this material. By the end of the period, there even seems to be standing arrangements with particular companies to this effect, that kind of particular companies are being kind of hired to come back to the same inns every year. 12th night continues to get the bulk of the attention, and I can't be too critical about this, since my interest in the inns records has developed from my work on an edition of the play. But in fact, I think if we look at the full records, there are several possibilities here relating to music that aren't at all clear from Manningham's account of 12th night alone. As is so often the way with performance records, in most cases, we simply have the information that the actors have been paid for a given performance and perhaps the sum of money. What's important for the sake of the accounts is a documentary receipt so that they can't come back claiming they haven't been paid yet. The details of the performance itself are not so important. But these bare records establish the regularity of the feast day arrangement, and sometimes which company, well often in fact, which company was involved, if less about the actual play that was performed. But there are a few records that are a little bit more forthcoming. And from these, we know that James Shirley's comedy Hyde Park was performed at Middle Temple on the 1st of November, 1632, and 3 otherwise unknown and probably lost plays, an Oxford tragedy, in a Temple Candlemas 1608, The Bridegroom and the Madman at Middle Temple, definitely Candlemas, probably 1619, though the receipt's not dated, and City Shuffler at Middle Temple for All Saints 1633. These play texts and titles are tantalizingly suggestive about the parts of a company's repertory that may have been most popular for inns performances. As I said, I don't think these are commissions being written specifically. I think they're being chosen from the standing repertory in the same way that court performances were simply chosen from the standing repertory. And obviously they represent a very small sample of the dozens of plays that were performed across the decades at the inns. But I do think that music is kind of notably and visibly important in these kind of in these traces that remain. There's I think a fairly clear preference for comedy here. I would put good money on The Bridegroom and the Madman being a comedy, probably City Shuffler. Oxford Tragedy would be a harder case to make as a comedy. I do think we can see that one. But I think there's a kind of, and obviously Hyde Park and 12th Night we know are comedies. So I think there's a bit of a preference for comedy here, which would imply more music. There's often a lot more song in comedy than other genres. There's also a stage tradition of performing madness through music, of course, from Ophelia through to the passionate Lord in Fletcher's The Nice Valor, which makes the loss of the bridegroom and the madman particularly frustrating. And in fact, the company even seemed to have received an extra payment of 11 shillings to cover the exceptional cost of the extraordinary musical resources that this particular play required. Some have speculated that The Bridegroom and the Madman is in fact an alternative title for The Nice Valor, in which case the pattern would be even clearer, because The Nice Valor is absolutely crammed full of music, including a series of songs in which the passionate lord expresses various states of humour or excess, the most famous of these being Hence All Ye Vain Delights, melancholy obviously, which circulated widely as a verse and musical setting in the period. I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on this possible identification, given the extent of early modern drama that we know to be lost and the risk of confirmation bias in this particular kind of theatre history. But what we can say with much more confidence is that the 2 extant plays that we know were chosen for performance at the inns, that's 12th Night and Hyde Park, are noticeably musical. They're noticeably musical when compared to the rest of the likely repertory that would have been in performance at the same time, and so which they were chosen in preference over, presumably, and also in relation to kind of Shirley and Shakespeare's wider dramatic output. 12th Night is by various measures considered one of Shakespeare's most musical plays, kind of together with The Tempest. And Hyde Park, a bit less familiar, but is similarly song-rich, as Shirley Bell has recently explored in her important doctorate on music and Caroline drama. And it's also striking for the amount of dance music it requires. One of the three main plot lines revolves around a supposed widow's remarriage and her disguised former husband, who is presumed long drowned, who makes a perhaps questionable decision to hang around in disguise, getting more and more angry, rather than simply revealing that he's alive. And all of this leads to a lot of very kind of narrative central dancing. This includes a spectacular entry of the wife and her new groom's wedding party dancing on the right-hand side there. And then it develops into a full quarrel between Bonavent, the previous husband, and his wife's new husband about a perceived affront in relation to who gets to dance with who, before they all dance in together at the end of the scene in another kind of set-piece moment. I do see the irony of using evidence about one-off feast day performances, albeit as part of an annual custom, as part of an argument about ubiquity. But what I do wonder here is whether what the Innsmen thought they were doing when they hired the acting companies for these occasions was as much buying in the music that was synonymous with Playhouse performance and recognizable as part of London soundscape as it was any other kind of aspect of dramatic performance. It's that kind of ubiquity that they're wanting to get into the evening. Of course, these command performances, they're not every day, but do they perhaps tell us something about the pervasiveness of Playhouse music and its desirability as an available element to incorporate into the gallimaufry that was the Inns of Court revels? I'll just finish quickly then with a final means of approach through extant texts, kind of verbal, musical, or both, which are in sources other than play texts, but that have some kind of relationship to songs performed in the theatre. I hope that makes sense. I think that sources of this kind simultaneously offer some of the strongest evidence for everyday encounters with music that has a relationship to the theatres. But I think these sources also raise some really important questions about how playhousey that music actually seemed to early modern subjects engaging with it when they found it in other contexts. I think there's a need for a bit of caution here in case the very concept of playhouse music and seeing this music in relation to its kind of dramatic context ends up colouring the way we see the surviving evidence in ways that might have a bit more to do with the kind of the prominence of early modern drama and especially Shakespeare in the kind of cultural moment of later critics than it necessarily does with early modern perceptions. Other than the lyrics of songs that are printed in playbooks and the few surviving manuscript play texts, almost all the evidence that we have about specific songs associated with the theatre come from sources that are at least one removed from the Playhouse. Tunes are identified by matching manuscript songbooks or restoration dance manuals or printed part song sets with the words or the title or simply the meter of what's included in the extant printed play. And this method has been remarkably effective. It's been kind of transformative, really. However, if we're thinking as well about circulation, exchange, and ubiquity, it's also striking how rarely these sources seem at all interested in indicating that they've got a theatrical provenance. There are some exceptions. The song from the Spanish Gypsy that I've been doing some thinking about recently does take up the title of the play as its kind of ballad tune name as it circulates fairly widely, suggesting that its theatrical back history was perhaps being signalled as it circulated. But if we think about the various mid-17th century manuscript songbooks that are the major source for Jacobean and Caroline drama, for instance, there's just no indication that these songs are taken from plays. Even John Wilson's self-archived volume at the Bodleian Library seems more interested in effacing the theatrical context for which he wrote so much of its contents than it does in celebrating what appears to have been a very long-standing role as the King's Men's principal composer before he became an Oxford professor. Now, this doesn't stop the songs being playhouse music in some sense. And in fact, we could even argue the opposite, that the very fact that they're not marked off as a free-floating bit of a play, but they're simply moving more fluidly into wider musical cultures of transformation, adaptation, appropriation, and exchange, is in one sense an even clearer indication of a kind of ubiquity than some of the other kind of approaches I've taken in this paper. But I think it's important to distinguish between the wide cultural circulation of something that's recognized as playhouse music and the idea that some music could have been ubiquitous and been used in the playhouse without the former necessarily recalling the latter. I'll just give a quick example then that I hope demonstrates why I think this is an important distinction. And I think that's especially the case if we're serious about approaching theatres as part of London's full musical landscape, as the very structure of today is encouraging, rather than only kind of venturing into that context in the hope of shedding light on the plays. For what I think are probably quite self-evident reasons, this is a particular issue, I think, when working on Shakespeare. And the example I want to mention indeed comes from my current work on Twelfth Night. Many of you will be familiar with the dialogue song performed by Sir Toby Belch and Feste in order to defy Malvolio after he has come downstairs in the middle of the night and berated them for singing Hold Thy Peace loudly enough to wake the entire household. A lovely choice of catch in that case. And this has long been identified as a version of a song that's first recorded in Robert Jones's first book of songs or airs of 1600, possibly composed by Jones, possibly his setting of an earlier ballad. Now, this song has a tradition of parody or adaptation, however you want to kind of frame it. David Greer's important 1990 study of 5 versions of the composition includes a Scottish version, for example, that shifts its premise from being about a jilted lover complaining quite pathetically about a female beloved to a more general statement of world weariness and the comfort of God's mercy, without the kind of explicit kind of earthly love context, which is very clear in Jones's version. And what Shakespeare offers is, of course, a parody, very, very clearly. This self-indulgent solo love lyric becomes a conversation between two figures who couldn't be much further from the stereotype of the Petrarchan lover. The subject matter shifts to Toby's life in the fast lane. His days are almost done. He's been moving too fast. And then it goes on to the advisability of whether they should bid Malvolio go, tell him to shove off, essentially, given the amount of trouble they're already in. This screenshot is from the wonderful Shakespeare documented resource that's made an enormous amount of archival material available and accessible to researchers and students, material that was previously the preserve of the geographically and institutionally privileged. And it's such an important project. And I'm really pleased that they've included this particular document here. But I would like to put a little bit of pressure on the suggestion that what it contains is a copy of Sir Toby Belch's song in 12 Nights. Actually, this is pretty clearly a version of the Jilted Lover song published by Jones and printed as well in a 1624 poetry book. That's the manuscript version on the right, and that's Robert Jones on the left. It's very, very close, with the odd small change that's characteristic of miscellanies. You becoming I, or thou becoming I in the first line is the interesting shift there. But it's not the parody in dialogue form that Shakespeare gives us. I'd love to be persuaded otherwise, but I can't see any indication at all that the compiler of this manuscript had any awareness of or kind of recourse to the song in 12th Night here, which of course wasn't printed until 1623 in the first folio, as opposed to the version that's come down to us today through Jones's printed music. I think it does tell us something significant about Shakespeare's engagement with ubiquitous music, that the song he is parodying is demonstrably circulating in a manuscript, possibly circa 1600, though I suspect that the dating of the manuscript is itself based on the dates of Jones and 12 Nights' early performances. But I also think that conceptualizing this manuscript as a copy of Toby Belch's song in 12 Nights indicates a sequence of transmission that isn't what the text itself is quite indicating. And crucially for the question of ubiquity, suggests that it's more widely familiar as Playhouse music in a way that I'm not sure is completely warranted by the evidence on the page. So in my paper this morning, I've set out to trace some ways in which Playhouse music might be considered ubiquitous, from its significance in the plays themselves and the specific appeal of music to playgoers, through its prominence in the wider London soundscape, to evidence of its reappearance in other early modern contexts. I hope it's not too outrageous to suggest that the Inns of Court was specifically interested in borrowing a culturally pervasive kind of form of music for their feast days. At the very least, this would be entirely consistent with the extremely partial evidence that survived. And it's clear as well that songs moved in and out of the Playhouse to an enormous extent throughout the period, and as many people have worked on previously. But I do think that in light of my final example, questions remain as to how much this circulation can tell us about the ubiquity of Playhouse music as recognizably theatrical, or alternatively, whether it might in fact be telling us a bit more about a Playhouse preference for including music that was already itself ubiquitous. Thank you very much.